Alright, lately I've been getting questions from some people whether or not we would return to using tracker software. I was having some beers with my friend Slava Nardakov from the band Nebulae Complex. Well, I was actually having a gin, but he was having beer. But he asked whether I'd return to tracker software, and we've had this question from a few other people, so I figured I would answer this via video. In my very early days in my first band, Adam Hates You, my first introduction to sequencing software was a piece of software called Impulse Tracker, version 2.14 I do believe, and that was kind of where I was learning how to sequence, how to get my sample chops better, like making sure that my samples are, when you program them in a tracker, you want to depending on what you're trying to do, you want to program in such a way that your samples begin and end, begin and then end, and then when you trigger the sample again, it's almost like a perfect little continuation of that particular sound. And there's no like choppiness in it, there's no like clicks or anything like that. And well, at the time it was something that was accessible to me. Unfortunately, I did not have a huge budget to do stuff. Unfortunately, nothing really came out of that band, but the one thing that did come out of it was that I was learning how to use Impulse Tracker. And then after I dissolved that band and came here to Calgary, I wrote my first album using Impulse Tracker, and then after I'd moved to Calgary, and then the albums that came after that I was using. Part of the second album was it's called We Are Here to Dance. Part of that album was written in Impulse Tracker, and another, I think, was it? No, it was entirely written in Impulse Tracker. And then the third album, TCP/IP, that was written partially with Impulse Tracker, and then I came across another tracker software, Windows-based tracker software at the time, called Jessica La Buzz Tracker, and then I started writing in that. Jessica La Buzz Tracker is a little different than Impulse Tracker. Impulse Tracker, there's some inbuilt samples, sort of, some inbuilt effects like vibrato and stuff like that. There was no real like reverb or delay effects. It was primarily sample based, so if you're looking to get guitars into it, you would have to sample your guitars and make sure it's the right timing for the song you're working on, and then pull those samples cut up those samples and then pull them into Impulse Tracker and then sequence them in accordingly. And Jessica La Buzz Tracker, on the other hand, it wasn't just a sample tracker, it had its own inbuilt effects. Oh, that was something else I wanted to mention. The Impulse Tracker, I actually had to program in my delays and stuff, so if I wanted something to delay a little bit, what you had to do was you had to program in one channel your whatever it was, whatever you're trying to do, and then you'd offset the second channel by how much ever you want your delay. And then what you would do is when it delays, you lower the volume gradually for each instance of that sample that's repeating the initial sample, or is a clone of that, but a little bit further down in the sequencing lane or channel or whatever it is. And that's kind of how you had to do it with that software. But Jessica La Buzz Tracker offered not only sample sequencing, but also it had its own inbuilt synths and drum machines and stuff like that. You could of course you could import your own drum sounds or whatever you want to do, but it had, if you got any of the expansion packs or whatever for it, once again, Jessica La Buzz Tracker is free tracker software. I think it's still in existence. I think they're still developing it. I know they stopped doing that, but for a while, and then it's picked up development again. But it had all kinds of synths that were in some of the expansion packs or whatever you want to call them. You could load in VSTs if you wanted to in some of the later versions of it, and yeah. So and now I know there's a software called Renoise, which I have not really tried out. So I don't know to what extent you can do your sequencing in. I know it's fairly robust, however, I think it's the same idea where it's primarily, I think you can load VSTs into it, but I think for vocals and such, like if you're working in renoise, you have to sample your vocals and then sequence them in the tracker lanes. As far as I understand, I could be mistaken. If I am mistaken and you have differing information, just let me know in the comment section, or let us know in the comment section. But that's the one thing with trackers. It's not really recording software. It's not the ones that I've used are not primarily digital audio workstations. They're mainly used for sequencing and sequencing synths or sequencing samples, and they weren't really made to record vocals or record guitar parts. Generally, if you wanted to do that and add them into those tracker songs, you would need to sample those pieces and then put them into the song and make sure they're properly timed and stuff when you're initially writing them and stuff like that. So that's the one thing about trackers. The other thing is trackers are typically typically grid sequencing structures, so you're working in grids and you can't really offset things too much. I know on some trackers I think you can offset things a little bit, but I'm actually the trackers that I've used, you weren't able to do that, at least at the time. So that's the thing with trackers, is that they're grid based, so you're working within a grid. And for me, I don't like working in grid structures because I feel like it gets a little bit too robotic and there's no real like human element to it, which I think working in a traditional DAW like FL Studio, you don't necessarily need to stay on the grid. You can offset things and make them sound like they're played more human, or you could actually play the parts and have the MIDI notes show up in the piano roll in FL Studio, and then you can quantize it a little bit, or you can leave it the way it is, or whatever you want. You can do whatever you want with it, and that's the one thing. That's the one thing I like, is because I don't like things being perfect. I like having imperfections and stuff like that. Although I do like some quantization for certain things, like if you're doing a 4-on-the-floor beat, you don't necessarily want it off the grid so much, depending on what you're trying to do. But I think if you're going for 4-on-the-floor EBM or something like that, I think going off grid is counterintuitive to that kind of music. But I think for something to start with, yes, tracker programs are great entryway into sequencing and understanding how sequences are. So for some pieces of gear, how it's structured and how you can quantize certain things and all of that. I think it's a great place for learning about sequencing. I also think it's a great place to get better at sample chops, especially if you're using a tracker-based program that primarily uses samples for its audio. I think because it depending on what you're trying to do, like this is all dependent on what you're trying to do. For me, sometimes I liked having these like perfectly chopped samples, that perfectly cut samples that if you loop it, it just sounds like it sounds very natural. Whereas if you have something with a pop or a click, you can hear those clicks when it loops and stuff. And I think tracker programs are good for kind of learning about how to get your samples to line up very, very nicely, so that you don't have any of those clicks or whatever. As I stated earlier, doing vocals, you can't really do that in tracker software. As far as the stuff I've used, you can't really record vocals. That's something you have to sample and then insert into the sequencer in the various channels in the tracker based software to get those to line up properly, which makes me, which if you think about it, if you're going to use tracker software and then you're going into a digital audio workstation to get your vocals down, if you think about it, most digital audio workstations, most recording and sequencing software like digital audio workstations like FL Studio, it has its own inbuilt sequencers anyway, so there's no real reason to use tracker software, at least in my mind. And then of course with digital audio workstations you can have more of that human feel in your tracks. You can play them to sound human, or you can sequence them and offset some things to make it sound a little bit more not perfect or whatever. And I think if you're using, yeah, I think it just makes sense to use a digital audio workstation nowadays for fun and to get an idea of what sample chopping or sample cutting is about. Yes, definitely tracker software. I think it's a good place to start for learning about sequencing and stuff. And there's some great free options out there like Jessica La Buzz Tracker. And you know, that stuff can be fun too. Like you don't necessarily, you can just get into it to just have fun, to see what it's all about. But for me, I'd rather work in a digital audio workstation and record that way. The only way a tracker would make sense, at least for me, is if it had offered more functionality than a digital audio workstation. That's kind of where I come from it nowadays. So, but yes, interesting conversation with a friend about tracker software the other day, and he asked if I would ever return to it, and quite frankly, I probably wouldn't unless it was a challenge, which I stated earlier. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I mean, it would be kind of interesting to see if I could still work in it and see what I could do with it. But I'm more interested in, you know, writing music and doing things in a digital audio workstation rather a tracker, because I feel there's more control in a DAW or digital audio workstation. So that's it for this video. I figured I would make this because I'm sure some of you are curious about trackers, and you might want to know some pros and cons of trackers. I think this video's kind of gone over them for the most part, but great place to start, I would say. But if you're looking for something a little bit more advanced and a little bit more, something with a little bit more control over your songs and the way that it is sequenced and all of that, I would definitely recommend something other than a tracker program. I would recommend a fully fledged digital audio workstation for that kind of stuff. But that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, obviously give it a like. If you feel it has value, please share it with your buddies. Maybe you guys are looking for something to do your music in, to build your sequences. Maybe a tracker program is what you're looking for. So hey, maybe share this. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. And if you feel this channel has value, hit that subscribe button to be notified when the next video comes out. So see you in the next video. Fuck yeah.